Hello there everybody. In my series of videos on the spiral method, I received some comments asking me if I used other techniques for trying to understand languages more logically. And the answer is of course yes. I use a whole bunch of different techniques. The spiral method is at the core of it, but I decided I'd make a video about one of the supplementary techniques that I find very beneficial in order to try and get a logical grasp of some subtle things. And we'll look at it through the perspective of learning verbs, but it does apply to anything. You can learn any aspect of a language with this technique, and I certainly do very frequently. And I think this is a technique which is particularly beneficial when you're at an intermediate or more advanced stage and you're really trying to understand subtle differences between things that aren't immediately clear. And they help work as a thinking tool, a way for your mind to understand things, to see where the gaps are, and to see how things relate to one another. So let's get on with it. Imagine that we're learning some language. Czech is my typical example, and we're going to learn a few verbs. So for example, we will learn work, which in Czech is pracovat, to think, myslet, to sleep, spát. So what we can do is we can create word lists like this. We could put these things into something like Anki and study these lists and their direct meanings in English. Now I'll switch the rest of the presentation to just pretend we're learning English so it makes it relevant to people. But of course, in reality, you'd be using this for a target language that you're learning. The problem with learning lists of words, such as those I've just shown, is that they only give you a very basic grasp of the meanings and how to use them. For example, it's not clear how we actually use these various words, these various verbs. So how do we use them? In Czech, for example, we don't think about somebody, we think on somebody. So even if you've learned think is myslet, it's not clear that you think on somebody. Okay, so that's a deeper type of knowledge you have to know when there are many of these idiomatic things that you just have to learn about the language. And the second is, how do you differentiate between verbs that seem very related? For example, she overslept yesterday is very different from she slept over at Peter's house yesterday. So the fact that over and slept are switched around completely changes the meaning. Of course, you could say she overslept when she slept over at Peter's, you see. So these deeper meanings aren't immediately clear from studying word lists, but there's something you have to get a very deep grasp of in order to be very conversant in a language. So what I'm going to show you is a way that I managed to do this rather than just assuming that my brain's going to somehow make sense of it, which it does over time, of course it does, and that's central. But I also like to take a more active approach in order to see where my brain isn't making the connections, or to where I can see there are holes, and then I can take some active response to that to make things move a little bit better. So I'm going to talk in particular about something that I've been doing called language mapping. And language mapping is based on something called concept mapping. You can find all about concept mapping on Google. There are many references to it. One of the best known forms of it is something called mind mapping. And this is where you simply put some term down, something that you're interested in, and then immediately all the associations you have with it, you put around the edges of it and connect with arrows. And then for each of those, the connections that you have, you put around them and connect with arrows, and you end up with this network spreading out of connected things. And it helps to follow your thoughts, to organize your thoughts, and to see where you need to think a little bit more. Now we'll come to some practical examples now with language, with verbs. Let's look at the single verb work, to work. Well, it's often used as a phrasal verb. A phrasal verb is a verb which is followed by a preposition, an adverb, or sometimes another verb. Here are some good examples. So work through. So I work through the night. I work through the pain in my shoulder. I work through an agency, not directly for the company. So as you see, over time you have to learn the phrasal verb work through and typical uses of it. So here are some other things you can say. I work around. I work around here. I work around the clock. That means I work a long time, of course. How about for? I work for a living. I work for the FBI. I work for peanuts. Very little money. How about this one? I work to rule. Now this one might not be familiar to some people in certain countries. I believe it applies certainly in the UK and perhaps in Australia. I'm not sure about that. And that means that a person is literally following the rule book describing their job in order to work very, very slowly, showing no creativity. And this is a form of protest against their working conditions, saying we're not going to be flexible. It's a bit like going on strike, but not quite as severe. Very heavily used in the United Kingdom in the 1970s. So you will hear people say they work to rule. If you don't know the idiom, you won't understand it. So understanding these things is an ongoing process of developing these associations and these idioms and so on. And to rely on your brain to do it is very, 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 very trusting of your brain, which is fine, but also it means that you're leaving things almost to accident. And I prefer to take a more deliberate approach. So the actual notation used for language mapping isn't particularly relevant. You just have things that are connected. So here's a sample. Don't take any particular notice of the colours or the notation. I just made one 5 minutes ago. So we could say work is in the centre here. And I can say that you can work through the pain or the night, through an agency, for the FBI and so on, for a living and for peanuts. And you follow it. You can work around the clock or around here, work to rule, or work. Here's another one that I thought of since writing that list earlier. Rule, I work to pay the rent. Now, is that the same as working for peanuts? Working for a living. Is that the same as working for a living? Good question. So I've put a question in here. Now, what's important here is that this is not a formal notation. So it doesn't have a mathematical interpretation. These are not necessary to share with other people to communicate anything. They're for you to trigger your thinking process, to guide your thinking along and to remind you of things. So you can put whatever you want in here. You're not restricted by a specific notation. So I've put, just for fun, dotted ellipses around a living and rent and pay the rent. And an arrow saying, are these the same? Something for me to investigate in the future. Yes? So, yeah, I have been doing this for quite some time with Czech, as you would expect, and sometimes these things can be quite small. I've got a book, full of them here. I've got loads of them, so... Well, as you can see, we don't need to get into the specifics. I've been using a tool called FreeMind. It's one word, F-R-E-E-M-I-N-D, which is free of charge. It's open source software, and it works very well. It's not particularly any better than writing things by hand, other than you can maintain them easily, make changes and so on. So here you see the verb to return in English. So if you want to return something in Czech, there are two. You can say vracet se a vrátit. No, sorry, vracet a vrátit plus a noun in the accusative. It doesn't really matter what words are in here. I'm just showing that you can say to return yourself. I am returning from somewhere, for example. So it's mapping out different ways of saying to return. Now, that's a simple case, but some of them get more complicated. So here, to start with something, to start an affair with somebody. Again, don't worry about the particular content here. It's only relevant to people who have been studying Czech. But you can see that it's just these fingers branching out with connections between things. They start to get very complicated. To think this is going to be too small for you to see, but it says things like just to think a thought, or to think personally, to have a belief, or to think through a problem, to think over something, to rethink something, to think up a new idea, to create something, to ponder on something for a long time, to imagine something, to predict something. I think this is going to happen. To suppose something. So these things are all related. Yes, around a single concept. And over time, I add to these as I find new things out about the language. And again, it goes on and on and on for many different... Mine aren't centered around a single verb. Each is centered around some concept. So here, for example, to speak. There are very many different verbs for speaking in Czech, each with slight differences. And to give, I mean, this one is very, very, very sophisticated. So, surprisingly, take is not quite as complicated as to give, but it shows that the networks can keep growing. And over time, when I get confused, for example, here are several verbs meaning to uncover or expose something. I wasn't quite sure of the difference between odhalovat and odkryvat in Czech, and it turns out that odhalovat relates to something that was deliberately hidden as a secret, whereas odkryvat can refer to that, but it can refer just to uncovering a pan that's got a lid on it and things like that. So that's it. I'm not trying to sell anything here, just expressing to people that as well as using the things expressed in my videos on the spiral method, I'm using this language mapping technique to see relationships between things. I talked about verbs there, but I use it for other aspects of languages too, and it really helps me to see the connections, to think through things, and to see where there are holes in my knowledge and understanding, and where I'm confused. So that's it. Thank you very much.